Good morning. Canada must take strong action to address climate change and protect our environment. We must also simultaneously address a crisis of rising costs, a crisis of national unity, and a crisis of waning hope of economic inclusion for many Canadians, particularly young people. Canada has the capacity to do all of these things. However, the Trudeau Liberal government has made many promises on these issues, but has failed to deliver. This month, the Liberals had a disappointing performance at the COP26 Climate Summit, and this week delivered a throne speech that had precious little vision as to how Canada will both fight climate change and ensure that Canadians can make ends meet. With the resumption of Parliament, Canada's Conservatives will be holding the government to account on these issues and giving Canadians a real plan. We'll work with a sense of urgency that climate action deserves. Years of lip service to enacting policies that will materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the federal Liberals must end. We will also work from an understanding that moving towards a low-carbon economy won't just magically happen without extensive planning, collaboration across levels of government, political stripe, workers, industry groups, and average Canadians who right now are struggling to make ends meet. The reality is that Justin Trudeau has failed to address that there are precious little alternatives in many parts of the country to using high-carbon Saudi oil to get around, get the goods to people who need them, or ensure we stay warm. In economic terms, we understand that in our country, there aren't enough affordable alternatives to carbon fuel. That is, higher prices of carbon doesn't necessarily mean that a Canadian will choose a different low-carbon product as a substitute because those alternatives don't readily exist. This means that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise while Canadians struggle to make ends meet with rising prices and loss of jobs. And that is the Liberals' true record on climate. Canada's Conservatives understand and know that there's a better way. We know that our natural resources must play a role in securing a sustainable future for our country and addressing these challenges. That's why we will present Canadians with policies that incent the development of low-carbon consumer alternatives to high-carbon products and activities and ensure that they are affordable. This will help Canadians lower their carbon footprints as opposed to simply costing them more to keep them the same. A good example of this is public transit. The Liberals have promised a lot of projects, but have failed to get them built. Even in major urban centres, many Canadians have to resort to driving simply because good public transit options don't exist. And now with fuel shortages and our reliance on high-carbon Saudi oil, Canadians are having trouble making ends meet due to high prices. Yet another example is the electricity we need to power things like electric vehicles. If the electricity we use to power an electric car is generated by high-carbon coal plants as opposed to low-emitting sources like nuclear, we have a problem. And yet, Justin Trudeau's Environment Minister won't even say that nuclear energy is an obvious alternative to coal. And this brings us to oil and gas. Right now, at this very moment, many Canadians are fueling their cars with high-carbon oil from places like Saudi Arabia, who have some of the worst carbon emission policies in the world. The Liberals have not put any emissions cap on the importation of that high-emitting fuel, which is shameful. Worse, the Liberals have offshored Canadian jobs and our own energy security to these regions. They've done this by failing to recognize that carbon energy in Canada is already being decarbonized or helping to accelerate that process. This is being done through incredible technologies like carbon sequestration and storage. While we move towards a low-carbon global economy, Canada's own low-carbon energy can and should be used to offset our reliance on high-carbon Saudi oil. Anyone who doesn't recognize that this is part of the problem, not part of the fight against climate change, has an issue. This week's failure on behalf of the Liberals to condemn the comments made by David Suzuki, which said that critical energy infrastructure might be blown up, is just one example of this. Canada cannot allow this to continue. There's too much at stake. The Liberals have talked a lot in recent weeks about carbon emissions in Canada, but they've failed on many fronts. They've failed to acknowledge that a 100 megaton emissions cap already exists for Canada's energy sector, which is working hard to decarbonize its production. In the words of both Alberta NDP opposition leader Rachel Notley and United Conservative Premier Jason Kenney, Alberta must be at the table when emissions caps are discussed, and I agree. Ms. Notley has also recently pointed out that this sector isn't the only part of Canada's economy that emits carbon dioxide. She said, if the federal government is going to be talking about emissions caps for the oil and gas industry, they need to be talking about emissions caps for all sectors. And again, I agree. That's why today, Canada's Conservatives are calling on the federal Liberal government to do the following. Actually build public transit infrastructure and create incentives which would develop viable, affordable alternatives to high carbon emitting consumer goods and practices, like Saudi oil. Acknowledge that Canada's fight to protect our environment and address climate change must unite our country, not come at the expense of one region of the country over another. If we're going to regulate one sector, it must be done across the board. Develop a plan to fight climate change that ensures that there's hope for affordable living for Canada's youth and addresses reconciliation. This includes Indigenous persons and the workers of natural resource industries, many of which are in Western Canada. This plan should respect provincial jurisdiction and give provinces the right and responsibility to develop their resources with clear targets to create energy security in Canada. This would include a plan to supply Canadians with domestically produced low-carbon energy and reduce imports of high emissions from fossil fuels produced overseas. Present a clear plan for Canadian workers who are unemployed due to this government's failure to address climate change while offshoring our jobs. This plan should set clear timelines and funding to facilitate skill retention and job growth in areas like Western Canada who have been significantly impacted. Obtain a clear guarantee from President Biden that his administration will support the continuation of the Line 5 pipeline. And align our carbon capture incentives with the US to ensure our innovators aren't left behind. Stop talking about it. Give our workers and communities the tools to compete. This is what Canada's Conservatives will be pressing for. We will be fighting for affordability for all Canadians, for climate action, and for jobs. We won't be dividing or pitting region versus region. We'll be uniting this country and holding this government to account. Thank you.
Do you think Canadians outside of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Newfoundland actually care about the job losses you speak of, care about the impacts felt in those provinces' oil and gas industries and energy industries more broadly?
Well, it's a little cold outside today, and I think a lot of Canadians care about the increased price of fuel, both to get around and also to heat their homes. I think they care deeply about the increased price of virtually everything, much of which are transported, and those price increases are passed along in increased prices of fuel. I think that it's also deeply unfair to say that people in other parts of the country aren't impacted by job losses in the energy sector. Steel workers in other parts of the country, many Atlantic Canadians work in there. And I think, just the fact that that question even exists tells me that there's a lot of misperceptions about how important Canada being able to produce a secure source of decarbonized energy, how pervasive that is and how harmful it is. I've watched as an Alberta MP this debate become so polarized, and I think for the political gain of the Liberals. The people in my province really do care about climate action. They want to be part of the solution. That's what we're calling for today, and I think that that's something that all Canadians do care about. I don't understand why we can't have it all, why we can't have energy security, why we can't use Canada's energy as part of a transition to a low carbon economy, why we can't secure jobs instead of offshoring them. So I think that is something that can unite Canadians. What I hope to achieve in this Parliament, particularly given the fact that we've seen a lot of increased rhetoric on the other side from the Liberals, is that type of caring approach. That will see real climate action, but will also protect our jobs and make life affordable for Canadians.
Before the last election, Conservatives came out with their own carbon price and their own emissions reduction goal. Are Conservatives sticking with carbon pricing as a policy that it endorses? Are you going to be reviewing the climate plan that was introduced, I believe, in April and ran on during the election?
So, as I said in my remarks, I think we have to start from an understanding that yes, we have to take urgent climate action. I feel that urgency. We also have to understand that, as I said in my remarks, like that is not going to magically happen overnight without us developing affordable, readily available alternatives to high carbon consumer products and price and practices. So I do think that there is a role for government to create incentives for the development of those alternatives. And that comes in very many different types of baskets. And that's where our party has been heading with its policies. Our the platform that we put forward in the last election and where we want to go in this parliament really does take that approach. It says, look, we agree with the international community. We agree with people who are raising the alarm bells on climate. We also know that, like, without those plans, for example, I'll use an example in my community. The Green Line, it's this massive transit project that had funding allocated to it 8 years ago that could have taken tens of thousands of cars off the road in my riding. It's nowhere to be seen, right? So you have to make sure that people have affordable alternatives to carbon in order for that behavior to change. Like in economist terms, I mean, carbon is still relatively price inelastic in Canada, and that's what we have to change. What I don't want to see happen is what we saw last week, where the Prime Minister went to a climate summit, announced a policy with no details, created a lot of concern both with consumers across the country, provincial governments, industry, and it really sort of has this destabilizing effect. If we have smart, sensible economic policies, we can do both. And I think that over the last 6 years of the Trudeau Liberal government, there really has been a lost opportunity to work with even people like me. My background is I worked at the University of Calgary, commercializing clean technology, carbon sequestration. This has to be a united front. And I'm really tired of the Liberals, sort of dunking on my province as opposed to taking climate action that makes life more affordable, creates jobs, and doesn't offshore them. So I think that we're going to present a really strong, smart opposition to the Liberals on this, and it will benefit all Canadians, and all Canadians will care.
And I'll check if there is any questions on the phone. Opératrice, avons-nous des questions au téléphone?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. Faites étoile 1 pour toute question. We have a question from Yasmin Hassan from CBC News. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Good morning. Thanks for taking our questions. I was just wondering about the medical exemptions. Would all of the medical exemptions currently provided to members of your caucus comply with the Ontario Ministry of Health and NACI guidelines on who should be eligible for these exemptions from vaccine requirements?
I'd like to take this opportunity to remind every Canadian that vaccines are safe and effective. I am fully vaccinated. I encourage every Canadian who has not yet gotten a vaccine for COVID-19 to do so. All of our members of Parliament are compliant with House of Commons rules on COVID restrictions, and we rely on the advice of medical experts, not the Liberal Party of Canada.
Follow up?
Thank you.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. We have no further question registered at this time.
This concludes the press conference. Ici met fin la conférence de presse. Merci.